In 1994, credit card tracking wasn't what it is today. Bank statements arrived weeks later through postal mail. Transactions were processed slowly, and nobody was watching in real time. This is why nobody noticed, not immediately anyway, that Kurt Cobain's credit card was being used on April 2nd, 1994, in downtown Seattle, making purchases that would later raise questions nobody wanted to answer. 2 days after those transactions, on April 5th, Kurt Cobain would be found dead in the greenhouse above his Lake Washington home. But on April the 2nd, while someone was swiping his card at retail stores across the city, Kurt Cobain was supposedly alone, unreachable, and according to every official account, already planning his final act. The problem was simple and disturbing. If Kurt was isolated at home, who was shopping with his card? And why did Seattle police never include these transactions in their suicide investigation file? Before we unravel this mystery that has haunted investigators for 3 decades, if you want to explore more untold stories from history, the dark secrets behind the legends, and the evidence that official reports tried to bury, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from bank records, private investigator files, and witness testimonies that were never supposed to become public. April 1st, 1994, started like any other spring day in Seattle. But for Kurt Cobain, it marked something else entirely. He had fled from Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles just 48 hours earlier, scaling a 6-foot wall in the early morning darkness and disappearing into the sprawling city. The rehabilitation facility had been Courtney Love's idea, a last-ditch effort to control what she publicly called Kurt's self-destructive spiral. But Kurt saw it differently. In conversations with friends during those final weeks, he'd described feeling trapped, monitored, and manipulated. The escape from Exodus wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. He'd planned it, talked about it, and when the moment came, he executed it with the determination of someone reclaiming his freedom. By the time staff noticed his absence at morning check-in, Kurt was already at Los Angeles International Airport, boarding Alaska Airlines Flight 851 to Seattle. He arrived at SeaTac Airport around noon on April 1st, and from that moment forward, his movements became fragmented, contradictory, and in some cases, physically impossible, according to the evidence that would later emerge. Taxi drivers, airport workers, and even a few fans claimed to have seen him, but none of these sightings aligned with what credit card records would eventually reveal. When Kurt arrived back in Seattle, he didn't go straight to the Lake Washington Boulevard house he shared with Courtney and their daughter, Frances Bean. Instead, according to fragmentary accounts, he may have stopped at several locations around the city. Some witnesses placed him near the University District, others near Capitol Hill, but nobody could provide definitive proof. What is certain, however, is that by the evening of April 1st, Kurt was at the house. A few close friends later recalled receiving brief, cryptic phone calls from him during those hours. The conversations were short, disconnected, as if Kurt was testing who he could still trust. He mentioned feeling watched, feeling like his life was no longer his own. One friend remembered him saying something chilling. "If something happens to me, don't believe the first story you hear." Those words would echo differently just days later when the news broke. But on April 2nd, something strange began to happen, something that wouldn't be discovered until weeks after Kurt's death, when a private investigator named Tom Grant started asking questions nobody else seemed interested in pursuing. April 2nd, 1994, between 1:15 p.m. and 4:47 p.m., Kurt Cobain's Visa credit card registered 4 separate transactions across downtown Seattle. The first charge appeared at Nordstrom department store on Pine Street at 1:15 p.m., a purchase totaling $163. The items? Women's clothing, a black dress, size small, and a cosmetics set from the Clinique counter. The sales associate who processed the transaction, a woman named Jennifer Hoyt, would later tell Tom Grant that the customer was female, approximately 5'6", with blonde hair and sunglasses that covered most of her face. When asked if she remembered checking identification, Hoyt admitted she hadn't. In 1994, credit card security was lax. Signatures were barely verified, and ID checks were optional, especially for transactions under $200. The second transaction occurred at 2:33 p.m. at Tower Records on Mercer Street. Another $87 charged to Kurt's card. The purchase included 2 compact discs and a magazine. The clerk, a young man named Aaron Burkhard, who ironically shared the same last name as Nirvana's original drummer, remembered the transaction vividly when interviewed months later. He'd been a massive Nirvana fan, and he'd looked at the credit card name when processing it. Kurt Cobain, it read. Burkhard looked up, expecting to see his hero, but instead he saw a woman in her late 20s or early 30s, wearing a leather jacket and dark lipstick. He'd wanted to ask if she was Kurt's wife, if she was Courtney Love, but the woman had been impatient, tapping her nails on the counter, checking her watch repeatedly. He'd processed the payment quickly and watched her leave without a word. The third transaction happened at 3:52 p.m. at a small boutique clothing store on Capitol Hill, another women's fashion purchase, this time totaling $212. The store, which has since closed, kept meticulous records, and those records showed the signed receipt. The signature was messy, rushed, but it clearly attempted to mimic K. Cobain. Handwriting analysts who later examined photocopies of that receipt noted inconsistencies with Kurt's known signature style. The loops were different, the pressure points were off, and the letter formation didn't match samples from Kurt's journals or official documents. But in 1994, nobody was checking. The fourth and final transaction that afternoon occurred at 4:47 p.m. at SeaTac International Airport. This one was different. It wasn't a purchase. It was an attempted airline ticket booking, a one-way flight to Los Angeles, departing that evening at 7:30 p.m. The transaction was initiated, but then canceled within minutes, showing up on the statement as a pending charge that was later voided. Why would someone use Kurt's card to almost book a flight back to Los Angeles, the city he had just fled from, and why cancel it so quickly? Tom Grant would spend months trying to answer these questions, and the answers he found would point toward something far more sinister than a simple case of credit card theft. Tom Grant was not your typical private investigator. A former Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy, he'd built a reputation for handling sensitive cases involving celebrities, missing persons, and suspicious deaths. When Courtney Love hired him on April 3, 1994, it was supposedly to find her missing husband. She told Grant that Kurt had disappeared after leaving rehab, that she was worried he might hurt himself, and that she needed someone discreet to track him down before the media turned it into a circus. Grant took the case, but from the very beginning, something felt wrong. Courtney's behavior didn't match that of a genuinely worried wife. She was evasive, contradictory, and strangely detached. During their first phone conversation, she'd mentioned that Kurt was probably hiding out somewhere with friends, maybe scoring drugs, maybe just trying to avoid responsibility. There was no panic in her voice, no desperation, just calculated control. Grant arrived in Seattle on April 4th and immediately began retracing Kurt's steps. He spoke with friends, visited known hangouts, and checked with local drug dealers who might have seen him. Nobody had. It was as if Kurt had vanished into thin air after April 1st. Then, on the morning of April 5th, everything changed. Electrician Gary Smith arrived at the Lake Washington house to install security lighting. He'd been hired by Courtney a week earlier, a job that had been postponed and rescheduled multiple times. When Smith reached the greenhouse above the detached garage, he looked through the window and saw what he initially thought was a mannequin lying on the floor. Then he saw the blood. Then he saw the shotgun. Within minutes, Seattle police arrived, secured the scene, and began processing what they immediately classified as a suicide. Kurt Donald Cobain, 27 years old, found dead with a shotgun wound to the head. A nearby suicide note addressed to his childhood imaginary friend, Bada, and a cigar box containing drug paraphernalia. The medical examiner would later determine that Kurt had been dead for approximately 3 days, placing his time of death somewhere around April 5th in the early morning hours, though the exact timeline remained murky due to decomposition factors. The official report was swift, conclusive, and final. Suicide by self-inflicted shotgun wound. Case closed. But Tom Grant wasn't satisfied. When he heard the news, he was still in Seattle, still working the case that Courtney had hired him for. And that's when things got strange. Courtney called him immediately after learning of Kurt's death, but her reaction was theatrical, performative, as if she'd been rehearsing it. "Oh my God, Tom, they found him. He's dead. I knew this would happen." Grant noted the phrasing. Not, "Is he really gone?" or "How did this happen?" but rather, "I knew this would happen," as if the outcome had been expected, even planned. Within hours, Courtney fired Grant, thanked him for his efforts, and paid him in full with a generous bonus. She told him his services were no longer needed and that the family wanted privacy. But Grant couldn't let it go. He'd seen too many inconsistencies, too many red flags that pointed away from suicide and toward something much darker. Over the following weeks and months, Tom Grant conducted his own parallel investigation, one that would never appear in any official police file. He obtained copies of the bank statements for Kurt's credit cards, including the Visa that had been used on April the 2nd. When he saw those transactions, he immediately recognized the problem. If Kurt had died in the early morning hours of April 5th, and if he'd been isolated and alone at the house for days leading up to that moment, how could his credit card have been used so actively on April 2nd? Grant requested the transaction receipts, interviewed the store employees who had processed the sales, and compiled witness descriptions. Every single person described the same thing. A woman, not Kurt, not a man. A woman in her late 20s to early 30s, blonde hair, sunglasses, impatient demeanor. Grant took this evidence to Seattle police, specifically to Detective Antonio Terry, who had been assigned to Kurt's case. Terry's response was dismissive, almost hostile. He told Grant that credit card fraud was common, that someone had probably stolen Kurt's card days earlier, and that it had no bearing on the suicide investigation. When Grant pressed further, asking why the card hadn't been reported stolen, and why the transaction stopped immediately after April 2nd, Terry shut down the conversation. "The case is closed, Mr. Grant. Kurt Cobain killed himself. We have a note. We have a body. We have a weapon. Stop trying to create mysteries where none exist." But the mysteries were already there, piling up like discarded drafts of a song that never quite worked. The shotgun, for instance. It was a Remington Model 11, 20 gauge, a weapon with a long barrel and significant reach. Forensic experts Grant consulted pointed out that it would have been nearly impossible for someone of Kurt's height and arm length to position the barrel under his chin and reach the trigger simultaneously, especially if he was under the influence of the massive heroin dose found in his system. The toxicology report showed Kurt's blood heroin level at 1.52 milligrams per liter, a concentration so high that most users would be incapacitated, unconscious, or dead from overdose before they could complete any physical action, let alone load a shotgun, position it correctly, and pull the trigger. Grant consulted with Dr. Cyril Wecht, a renowned forensic pathologist, who reviewed the autopsy findings and expressed serious doubts about the official suicide conclusion. With that level of heroin in his system, Wecht stated in a 1997 interview, Kurt Cobain should not have been physically capable of handling a firearm, much less firing it accurately. Then there was the suicide note itself. 4 pages, written on stationery from the Peninsula Hotel in New York. Most of it addressed to Boda and rambling about Kurt's disillusionment with fame, his guilt over not enjoying performing anymore, and his love for Frances Bean. But the final lines, the ones that explicitly mentioned suicide and said goodbye, were written in a noticeably different pen pressure and handwriting style. Forensic document examiners Grant hired noted that the bulk of the letter appeared to be a retirement letter from music, not a suicide note. Only the last paragraph transformed it into a farewell to life. While Kurt's final days in Seattle remain murky and contested, Courtney Love's whereabouts during that same period are meticulously documented through hotel records, phone logs, and witness testimonies. On March 30th, Courtney checked into the Peninsula Hotel in Beverly Hills under a pseudonym. She'd been in Los Angeles while Kurt was still at Exodus Recovery Center, though she hadn't visited him once during his brief stay. Phone records show that she made dozens of calls during March 31st and April 1st, including several to a Hollywood entertainment lawyer named Rosemary Carroll, who also happened to be handling Kurt and Courtney's prenuptial agreement reviews at the time. Carroll would later tell investigators that Courtney had been discussing divorce proceedings and asking about how Kurt's estate would be divided if they separated. The timing was significant. Kurt had recently expressed his intention to divorce Courtney, a decision he'd shared with several close friends and even his attorney. If they divorced, Courtney would lose access to the Nirvana royalties and the multi-million-dollar estate Kurt had built. But if Kurt died while they were still married, Courtney would inherit everything as his widow. On April the 2nd, the same day Kurt's credit card was being used across Seattle, Courtney was documented at the Peninsula Hotel in Los Angeles. She ordered room service at 11:45 a.m. Pacific Time, made a phone call to her publicist at 1:30 p.m., and checked out of the hotel at 4:15 p.m. But here's where the timeline gets interesting. Alaska Airlines records show that a first-class ticket was booked that afternoon for a Courtney Michelle Harrison, one of Courtney's known alternate names, on a flight departing Los Angeles at 6:50 p.m. and arriving in Seattle at 9:20 p.m. The ticket was paid for with cash at the airport counter. Courtney has always maintained that she was in Los Angeles throughout April 2nd and 3rd, that she didn't travel to Seattle until after learning of Kurt's death on April 5th. but the airline records suggest otherwise. If she flew to Seattle on the evening of April 2nd, she would have arrived around 9:30 p.m., had the entire night of April 3rd and 4th in the city, and then returned to Los Angeles before Kurt's body was discovered. Multiple witnesses claim to have seen Courtney in Seattle during those days. A bartender at the Crocodile Cafe on 2nd Avenue told Tom Grant that a woman matching Courtney's description was at the bar on the night of April 3rd, drinking heavily and making loud phone calls from the payphone near the restrooms. A cab driver named Ahmed Hassan reported picking up a blonde woman outside a Capitol Hill residence on the morning of April 4th, who asked to be taken to SeaTac Airport. When he later saw news coverage of Kurt's death and saw photos of Courtney, he contacted police to report the possible sighting, but his tip was never followed up. Most intriguingly, a neighbor of Kurt's, a retired teacher named Caitlin Moore, who lived 3 houses down on Lake Washington Boulevard, told investigators she'd seen a cab pull up to Kurt's house around 2 a.m. on April 4th. A woman exited the cab, stood outside the front gate for several minutes, as if waiting for someone, and then made a phone call from a cell phone. Moore couldn't identify the woman's face in the darkness, but she remembered the outline, the posture, and the agitated pacing. 20 minutes later, the woman got back into the cab and left. Moore thought nothing of it at the time, assuming it was a friend or relative checking on the property. It wasn't until after Kurt's death that she connected the dots and realized the timing was deeply suspicious. Tom Grant took the credit card evidence further than any official investigator ever did. He tracked down the specific items purchased on April 2nd and tried to trace where they ended up. The women's clothing from Nordstrom, the cosmetics, the CDs from Tower Records. None of them were ever found in Kurt's house, in Courtney's possessions, or anywhere else. They simply vanished. Grant theorized that whoever used the card that day was building an alibi, creating a trail that would suggest Kurt was alive and active on April 2nd, thereby narrowing the window of death and complicating any investigation into what really happened. If the official narrative held that Kurt died in the early hours of April 5th, and his card was still being used on April 2nd, then logically he must have been alive and capable of making purchases or lending his card to someone he trusted. This would rule out foul play scenarios involving earlier dates. But the flaw in that plan was that Kurt himself never used the card. Witnesses confirmed it was a woman. So the alibi only worked if people assumed Kurt had given his card to Courtney or another female friend. Yet Courtney claimed to be in Los Angeles, and no other woman in Kurt's life had any reason to be shopping with his card that day. Grant also investigated the attempted airline ticket purchase at SeaTac on April 2nd at 4:47 p.m. The transaction was initiated at a self-service kiosk, one of the early automated machines airports were testing in the mid-90s. No human interaction, no ID check, just insert the credit card and select your flight. The booking was for a one-way ticket to Los Angeles departing at 7:30 p.m. that evening. But within 3 minutes, the transaction was canceled. Grant obtained security footage from SeaTac for that date and time, though the quality was grainy and the angles were poor. The footage showed a figure approaching the kiosk, a person wearing a dark coat and a baseball cap pulled low over their face. The figure's height and build suggested female, but identification was impossible. What was clear, however, was the body language. The person looked around repeatedly, checking for cameras, for witnesses, for anyone watching. After canceling the transaction, the figure walked quickly toward the exit and disappeared into the parking structure. Grant believed this was a deliberate test, a way to see if Kurt's card was still active and if it could be used for larger purchases without triggering fraud alerts. When the transaction went through initially, the person realized the card was functional, but then canceled it to avoid leaving a definitive paper trail that could be traced. It was careful, calculated, and professional. Not the behavior of a random thief who'd stumbled upon a stolen credit card. Why did Seattle police refuse to investigate these credit card transactions? Why was Tom Grant's evidence dismissed so quickly and so thoroughly? These questions have fueled conspiracy theories for 3 decades. And while some of the claims are exaggerated or unfounded, there are legitimate concerns about how the case was handled. Detective Antonio Terry, the lead investigator, had a history of closing cases quickly, particularly those involving celebrities or high-profile individuals. His department was understaffed, overwhelmed, and eager to avoid the media circus that would inevitably follow if Kurt Cobain's death was treated as anything other than an open and shut suicide. Declaring it a homicide would have meant months, possibly years, of investigation, media scrutiny, legal battles, and public pressure. It was easier, cleaner, and professionally safer to call it a suicide and move on. But there's another layer to consider. Courtney Love had powerful connections in the music industry, legal representation that specialized in high-stakes criminal defense, and a public relations team that was already crafting the narrative before Kurt's body was even removed from the greenhouse. Within hours of the discovery, statements were being released, interviews were being arranged, and the story was being controlled. Courtney positioned herself as the grieving widow, the woman who had tried desperately to save her husband from his demons, but ultimately couldn't. In the weeks following Kurt's death, several people who had spoken to Tom Grant or expressed doubts about the suicide conclusion began receiving threats. A sound engineer named Eric Erlandson, who had worked with Nirvana during the In Utero sessions, told friends he'd been contacted by unknown individuals warning him to stop talking about Kurt's death. Erlandson had previously mentioned to Grant that Kurt had confided in him about feeling unsafe, about suspecting Courtney was trying to have him killed. After the threats, Erlandson went silent, refused interviews, and never spoke publicly about Kurt again. Another figure, a musician named Kristen Pfaff, who played bass for Courtney's band Hole, died under mysterious circumstances on June 16, 1994, just 2 months after Kurt. Her death was ruled a heroin overdose, but friends insisted Kristen had been clean for weeks and was planning to leave Hole and move back to Minneapolis to escape what she called the insanity in Seattle. She'd told her roommate that she knew things about Kurt's death, things that could destroy people. She never got the chance to share those things. Her death was quickly closed as an accidental overdose, another tragic casualty of the grunge scene's drug culture. But those close to her have never accepted that explanation. If we strip away the speculation and focus purely on the facts, here's what we know for certain. Kurt Cobain's credit card was used multiple times on April 2nd, 1994, by someone who was not Kurt. Witnesses consistently described a woman. The purchases included items that were never found and had no connection to Kurt's lifestyle or needs. An attempted airline ticket was booked, and then immediately canceled in a manner suggesting reconnaissance rather than genuine travel plans. Seattle police were presented with this evidence and chose not to pursue it, not to include it in the official case file, and not to investigate further. Tom Grant's work was dismissed, ridiculed, and eventually buried under the weight of official conclusions and media narratives that had already decided Kurt Cobain died by his own hand. Does this prove murder? No. Does it prove Courtney Love was involved? Not definitively. But it does prove something equally important. The investigation into Kurt Cobain's death was incomplete, compromised, and deliberately closed before all the evidence was examined. The credit card activity alone should have triggered deeper scrutiny, extended timelines, and serious questions about who had access to Kurt's finances and why they were using them in the days leading up to his death. Instead, those questions were never asked. 3 decades later, the case remains officially closed. No amount of public pressure, documentaries, or investigative journalism has succeeded in reopening it. Kurt Cobain is legally and officially a suicide victim, his death a tragic but straightforward result of depression, drug addiction, and self-destruction. But for those who look closely at the details, who examine the credit card records, who listen to the witnesses that were never heard, a different picture emerges. One where April 2nd, 1994, was not just another day in Kurt's final spiral. It was a day when someone was actively using his identity, his resources, and possibly his trust, for purposes that remain unexplained and uninvestigated. The woman at Nordstrom, the woman at Tower Records, the woman at SeaTac Airport. Who was she? Why was she using Kurt's card? And what happened to the items she purchased? These questions will likely never be answered, not because the answers don't exist, but because the systems designed to find them chose not to look. And in that choice, in that deliberate avoidance, lies the real mystery of Kurt Cobain's final days. Today, Kurt Cobain's death is remembered as one of the defining tragedies of the 1990s, a symbol of generational angst and the destructive cost of fame. But it's also remembered as something else by a growing number of people who refuse to accept the official story. It's remembered as a case that was never truly solved, a death that was never truly investigated, and a mystery that was buried under the weight of convenience and institutional apathy. The credit card transactions of April 2nd, 1994, are just one thread in a larger tapestry of inconsistencies, one piece of evidence among many that suggests the truth is more complicated than a simple suicide. Tom Grant continues to speak about the case, now in his 70s, still convinced that Kurt was murdered and that Courtney Love orchestrated it. His website remains active, filled with documents, recordings, and evidence that mainstream media largely ignores. Critics call him obsessed, delusional, a conspiracy theorist profiting off tragedy. But Grant has never written a book, never sold his story to Hollywood, never sought personal gain from his investigation. He simply wants the case reopened, the evidence examined properly, and the truth, whatever it may be, finally brought to light. Whether that will ever happen is uncertain. What is certain is that every time someone looks at those credit card receipts, every time someone reads the witness statements from store clerks who served a mysterious blonde woman on April 2nd, 1994, they're forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The official story doesn't add up. The timeline doesn't work. And somewhere in the gap Between what was investigated and what was ignored lies the real story of Kurt Cobain's final hours. A story written not in suicide notes and shotgun blasts, but in credit card transactions and unanswered questions that Seattle police decided weren't worth pursuing. And perhaps that's the most damning evidence of all.